Welcome to part two of my conversation with the latest Seatton guest. If you haven't heard the first part, start with the previous episode number. But if you have, let's pick up right where we left off.
But we haven't talked about some of the downsides of public education, which is one of the reasons why we started down this path to begin with. Would you like to go there?
Please. Yeah.
Well, I was first introduced to home education when I attended a conference to bring greetings, and the guest keynote speaker was a well-known psychologist by the name of Dr. Gordon Neufeld. And I stayed to listen to his talk and later read his book. And it jarred me when he said, and I'll never forget it, he said, there's many good reasons to home educate your child. There could be academic success, or as we talked about, customization, flexibility for parents who need that because their kids are involved in sports, or they want to travel, or they don't want to do art or music lessons at a very high level. It's also more efficient use of time. And there's other reasons. But he said, those are all good reasons, but the most important reason why you want to choose to educate your child is because you want to be the primary influence in their life. Institutional education involves sending your child away to a literal stranger for 30 plus hours a week in a peer-driven environment where they're surrounded by children of their own age. And that is who ends up being the primary influence in their life. And it's not a surprise, considering the amount of time that they spend in that setting. And Dr. Neufeld says that when that happens, the parents lose that primary influence. They don't bond as closely with their child because of that separation. And he said, that's what's missing. And that's why you want to keep your kids at home for as long as possible. That's why you want to be their primary educator, because you want to bond with your child. You want that relationship to be very, very close, because it's meant to last a lifetime. Whereas, unfortunately, in a school setting, it often drives a wedge between parents and their children, just the way it's structured, So that's something that your viewers or your listeners need to keep in mind.
And he actually makes the point, doesn't he, that this seems unusual to people because it's so pervasive now, this belief that this is what normal, particularly teenage behavior looks like. And he says that's actually just, it shows how widespread the problem is, that we actually just think this is now normal, quote unquote, normal, that your teenagers end up hating you, that they end up not being interested in school, that they have all these social problems. In the UK, we have a huge problem with teenage mental health at the moment. And this is increasingly just normalized as, oh, well, they're a teenager. And he's saying this doesn't have to be the case.
No, not at all. It doesn't have to be that way.
And I think, to take the flip side of that, you were a homeschooling family, your children are still home educated. How have you seen those positive benefits of how it's affected and shaped your family culture? Do you feel, you've done it from the beginning with your children, so it's difficult to have a counterpoint, but do you feel it's something that really has played into creating a strong family culture?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. When you get to spend that much more time with your children on a regular basis, those bonds remain strong and get stronger. And it's no surprise. I think of my own home, my own public school experience, and I can't say that I did not have a close relationship with my family, but I would say that it would be hard to emulate the kind of experience that you can have with your children when you're able to when one or both parents are able to spend more time with them. It's just a natural conclusion of time spent, right? It's quality time, but it's also quantity time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I suppose the flip side of that is sometimes people say, well, if they're spending that much time with their parents or at home, which I think maybe is a concept you might want to address, aren't you sheltering your children? How do you respond to criticisms like that?
So here I don't want to get too harsh about public school settings, but the reality is there is sheltering involved. You're sheltering your child from the bullying and the ridicule that they might experience from being in an institutional school setting, which unfortunately too many children have that experience, which is why they have these anti-bullying policies, because it happens all too often. So you are sheltering your children from having those emotional scars from a public school setting experience. You're sheltering them from what we talked about earlier in terms of being one of 20 or 30 students in a class where a teacher, despite their best efforts, could never provide the custom education that they might need or desire. So there is sheltering involved, no doubt. But at the same time, when done well, you're intentionally providing opportunities for your children to grow. So whether that's enlisting them in sports or in music lessons or in drama or in other learning opportunities, including what's now becoming more common, blended learning, where you might take 1 or 2 classes with other home educated students on a particular subject area. Like maybe you want to give them a unique experience in the sciences that you perhaps don't feel comfortable guiding them with, or they're not quite at that level of self-directed learning. So you can mix and match. Certainly phys ed is something that our kids have taken with many other students in a gymnasium, because we can't emulate that experience at home in terms of sports. So when you can intentionally provide these opportunities, you're really not sheltering them at all. You're just choosing very carefully how you're exposing them to the best and highest quality experiences.
And I think the misnomer is that that's something unique to home educating parents. I think all parents have in their mind what they do want to expose their child to and what they don't want to expose their child to. And of course, that will be different for different families. But I don't think it's fair to level that criticism purely at home educating families, because all parents will have certain things that they don't want their child to be affected by. That's just parenting. That's being a good parent. Exactly.
Yeah. You want to think about, what are my kids being exposed to? And sheltering is not a bad thing, especially at a young age. We do it intentionally. You don't want to put kids in a place where they're not mature enough to handle the circumstances. It wouldn't be wise.
I think you're right. I think what's difficult is because a lot of people, as you say, it is a relatively recent phenomenon. In one sense, the homeschooling movement. In another sense, in global history, you might say what we look at as school as a fairly recent phenomenon in terms of hundreds of years, but as opposed to thousands. But certainly this kind of modern homeschooling wave since maybe the 1980s, I think, as you mentioned, there aren't that many people, maybe more in the States, but there aren't that many people who are from 3+ generations of homeschoolers. And so I think a lot of people say, well, I went through that system where there was bullying, where I got roughed up at school, where I learnt from the school of hard knocks, and it's made me who I am today. So surely home educated kids are missing out on that. What do you say to them?
They might think they're better for it, but I don't think anybody is proud of the emotional scars that they might have endured as a student in an institutional school setting. I mean, I can think back to being bullied, and I was one of the taller kids in my class, but is it an experience that I would rather have avoided? I would far have rather been in an environment where I hadn't had that kind of experience. And for too many students, it's traumatic. It's really to the point where they fear going to school. They wake up dreading to head to that place because of what's been happening. So I don't think it's a realistic argument to say, oh, it's every child needs to have a little bit of that in their life to tough them up for adulthood. I don't buy that one bit.
I think you're right. And there's so much research now as well that suggests that it comes back to that point of emotional maturity. The form of bullying that exists at school, thankfully, does not exist largely in adult society. And if it does, you go to prison.
Exactly. Yeah. People have worked out the emotional issues by the time they are an adult. Yeah.
Exactly. And actually, also, you are that much older. You're equipped. Like, we don't expect our 1-year-old child to know the rules of the road. You hold your hand. You hold their hand when you cross the road. You're teaching them how to respond, that when the day comes that they do cross that road by themselves for the first time, they've practiced 1,000 times with you. They know what the danger is. They know how to address that danger. But they're prepared for it. And I think, personally, I completely agree with you that this idea of, well, it's sink or swim. Do you deal with it when you're 8? I mean, we don't have to expose children to dealing with these horrid things at such a young age when they're unprepared.
I agree entirely. Yeah. I mean, it's perhaps there was a belief at some point where you felt the need to send your child off, to an institution for learning because you felt incapable. The one advantage that I could see that might emerge from a school setting would be the social connections that you make. And I'm not talking about socialization at all. I'm simply talking about social connections. But I don't think that's significant at all in the undergraduate or in the early schooling years. Perhaps in a college environment where networking becomes important, but not, when kids are still kids, that's not critical. So even that doesn't hold water.
I don't think there's research on this, but anecdotally, I think you'll know this, mixing in home education circles a lot. But actually, home educated kids are often much less phased about talking to adults than school children who just mix with children of their own age. And often, if there is a connection that is useful to be made at that age, often it might be someone's parent is, offering an internship in the area that you want to go into or whatever. And actually that ability to look an adult in the eye and have the confidence to speak to them because you've been brought up around people of all ages all the time is actually probably a benefit.
So I have a story about that. Even before we had kids, but after this conference that I attended, I had an experience where a home educated group came to my member of parliament office. They were learning about government. And so they wanted to meet with their member of parliament. And I had done many school visits in the past at a variety of ages. And oftentimes the questions weren't great, or they were unfocused, or it was hard to have a conversation. So I kind of was wondering what this was going to be like. And when they arrived, they were all so respectful and polite, and their questions were thoughtful. And we engaged in a dialogue that, unlike what I'd ever experienced in a public school setting, and it left a really positive impression on me that, wow, these kids, they have access to something that I don't see in the public schooling system.
I don't know if you have this saying in Canada, we say the proof is in the pudding, of, seeing the end result is often actually take away all the statistics, take away all the research. I think there's something very compelling and not enough people do see a bunch of home educated children or young adults, but I think you're right. I think there's something very compelling about meeting, inspirational children who have been through this situation, and they themselves are a really excellent advertisement.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you're reaping the benefits at the moment, having 4 teenagers in the house. That must be so interesting, just to have 4 teenagers who you can discuss things with, and it's just an extension of their education, that now they're talking about things around the dinner table, I should imagine.
Absolutely. We try and protect the dinner time very carefully. Well, actually, even our breakfasts are able to have together, but dinner time becomes an area of conversation for public events and so on. But although Andrea does the vast majority of home educating in our family, I also take some initiative. And this past year we did, because of my background in philosophy and business, we did a series on logic and reasoning, where we're working through some books and learning about common fallacies to spot them. And then also a series on entrepreneurship. So I'm trying to get my kids interested early on in understanding that there's more to life than getting a 9-to-5 job. So there's ways that you can contribute.
Useful skill.
Yeah. And then more recently this summer, I took the initiative. They had some extra time, right? School's off. And so we kind of at the drop of the hat found this coding program where they can take a lesson a day, and in 100 days, develop some relatively useful skills. So we threw them into that and watching them grow and learn in that area as well.
You mentioned that your wife has done most of the core academic education with your children. It's great to hear you've sort of led them or guided them in these areas. More generally, how do you see your role as the father, or I suppose in some cases that will be the mother, but the non-direct educating parent in a homeschooling family?
Yeah, so I think it's important to acknowledge that there are dads that do this because of the circumstances that they're in, whatever that might be. So it's not exclusive to mothers to home educate, but the vast majority are moms, and we know this from our research. And so I think my role there is then to support her in whatever way I can, whether that's taking on some additional domestic responsibilities, which I do, or just making sure that the children understand how important it is that they follow the lead of their mother when it comes to education. Sometimes the roles get, there's no division between mom and mom, the educator. And there also needs to be some respect that's taught there in terms of how you relate to a person who's devoting their time to help you learn. So, that sometimes comes into play as well. And then, as I said, these periodic courses that I've taken initiative on to add my own flavor to what they're learning that doesn't fit within the normal, course of program studies that we have in place.
And with your twin boys, you still have, a good few years left on this journey. But is there one really special memory for you from your time home educating your family?
Well, what it does provide you is flexibility. And so the highlights that I think about over the years have been when we've been able to focus our studies on a particular destination, a vacation, study the history, study the geography for many months in advance, and then have that experience of going with them and being there and learning and cementing that knowledge that they gained in preparation. So those family vacations are clearly major highlights for the Heberts.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been wonderful to have a snapshot into your family's home education time and also your thoughts more broadly on home education. Thank you, Russ.
Oh, my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you so much for joining the Seatton Education podcast. Whether you watched us on YouTube or you listened as a podcast, please like, comment, and follow as we discuss how home education can be an achievable alternative to conventional schooling.